Welcome to our Nation State Dialogue series. राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today, it's our pleasure to have with us a very distinguished career diplomat who served as the National Security Advisor of India, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Of course, he needs no introduction, so I'm just going to talk a little bit brief in the sense that he was a Foreign Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, prior to which he served as Indian High Commission to Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and also Ambassador to China and Israel. He's currently a visiting professor of international relations at Ashoka University. He has written extensively and published many works, and his book, Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy, was one of the finest works I know about. Today, we have invited him to discuss his latest book, that is India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present. So welcome, sir, to our show. First of all, many congratulations for your latest book. Let me begin with inviting you to please introduce your book in brief and the driving factors behind writing this book.
Well, thank you for asking me, and thank you very much for this opportunity to introduce the book. The book is basically in two parts. I mean, one part is a survey with the past, is really a survey of Indian foreign and security policy and how India has acted as a nation power and how the Asian situation has affected how India acts or has acted. The second part, the present, is really a description of the present situation of where we are. And since I can't resist preaching, what I think we should be doing in this situation. Why did I write this book? Why did I think this was worth writing? You know, I teach a course in university on India and Asian geopolitics. And I suddenly realized one day that all my students were actually born in this century, and many of the things that were part of my life, my career, for them is ancient history. And yet I was amazed at how interested they were in what had happened in the 50s, in the 60s, how India interacted with the rest of the world. And I thought, if they're interested, maybe other people are also interested. So that's really how the book came about. Also, because frankly, I am convinced that India has done best when she is most connected to the world, most engaged with the world. And I'm a bit concerned that in the last few years, we have sort of turned inwards. We've turned away from the world, whether it is in terms of protectionism, raising customs duties, walking out of RCP, whether it's in terms of our thinking about the world. You know, the more, I mean, Atmanirbharta can easily shade into autarky. And I really think that not only do we need the world needs us. And we need to actually be active participants in Asia, especially now when things are changing so fast around us. So that's really, the book is a plea for engagement and involvement with the world by India. And of course, I say how I think we should do this.
Yeah, that is interesting because I think my students and most of the people who are working on India, on China, or understanding the foreign policy, they really want to know what has happened in the past, considering we have a continuity as well. I mean, it's not a complete breakage from the past to the present. And I think that is definitely there in your book. But I mean, the title of your book states India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which in some sense gives me an idea that it puts the focus on India as well as on China, who are also seen as the drivers for creating Asian century, if at any point that happens, you know. So yes, the tilt that is happening is more towards East Asia along with China. So rather than, you know, South Asia. So could you please shed some light on the future development of South Asia as a major pillar in the Asian century?
Well, I think if you take the longer view, in the last 2 decades, South Asia has done quite well in terms of its economic growth, in terms of its development, in terms of its growing importance. And I think South Asia's geopolitical importance in the world has also risen considerably, for the simple reason that during the Cold War, the center of geopolitical rivalry, the main fault lines were in Europe. It was between the Soviets and the Americans. And frankly, Russia, America, these were extensions of European civilizations going east and west. So it was really a European problem. And First World War was basically a European war. We call it a world war, but that was the European century, and it brought it to an end. Now, the center of gravity of the world economy, of world politics, is here in the Asia Pacific. And therefore, South Asia, India, are next to where the main fault lines are. What are the big issues today? Which flashpoints are live? East China Sea, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, Taiwan, South China Sea, India-China boundary. You look at the border and what happened last year. They're in Asia. Where is the center of gravity of the world economy? In the 1950s, it was somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. Today, it's east of the Urals and moving east steadily, as you said, towards East Asia as the weight of East Asia grows. But if you take by 2019, actually, India and China together accounted for more than half of Asia's GDP. So the weight of the world is here, and increasingly the share of India and China in global GDP and of other emerging economies has actually overtaken those of what were the G7 countries' share in 1980. So if you take the longer 30, 40-year view, clearly this part of the world matters now. Why does the US speak to Nepal and Bangladesh about joining the free and open Indo-Pacific? Why does the Chinese ambassador in Dhaka almost threateningly say to the Bangladeshis in public on television that you shouldn't join the Quad? Nobody's invited them to join the Quad, but he feels he has to say this kind of thing. Why is China so keen to involve Nepal in Belt and Road, in the Belt and Road Initiative? So there is a competition going on all around us. Outside powers are much more active in South Asia today for that same reason. Today, as I said, the Indian Ocean has become very important. The whole body of water from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of America, the Indo-Pacific, is increasingly important. This is where the maritime space is being contested between powers, between China and the US, between others. So, frankly, I think our geopolitical significance has grown, our economic significance to the world has grown. A lot of the book is about India and China, naturally, because of their relative weight. But it's about the rise of Asia. It's not only China that's risen, and it's not only India that's risen. I mean, there are established powers like Japan, the US, Russia, but then there's countries like Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia. There's a whole host of countries who are active participants in both the economic and the security processes in the region. So I think this is an exciting time, but it's also a very dangerous time because everything is changing. The whole balance of power is shifting. And so it creates both challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, I'll come back to the India-China border thing, which you just pointed out. But let me focus on what you were talking about, the Eurasian war. Basically, the World War was basically, Russia and, the Soviet Union and America. So let me put you two there and talk about Asian politics from that context. I mean, it's inevitable for us in India to look at India and China through Russia, though Russia is also partly, a main component on redesigning the matrix of Asia. So how do you see Russia's role in the changing order?
Well, I think Russia has three issues. I think one is she feels tremendous Western pressure, US pressure, European pressure in the Ukraine and various places. And what she sees is NATO and the EU coming up to her borders, which she feels she had been promised would not happen. And therefore, to a considerable extent, she has been driven into working very closely with China politically on the world stage. From our point of view, this complicates life, frankly. But Russia is an essential partner for us, and we do share a whole host of interests. My own sort of short summary of it is, we need to work with the US because the US is the world's #1 maritime power and she's active in the Indo-Pacific. And if we want to keep the Indo-Pacific free, open, rule-based, safe, secure for our shipping, then we work with the existing powers who have the power to keep it so. But we are also a continental power. And many of our problems are on land in Asia. And for that, we need to find continental partners. We have to work with Iran, we have to work with Russia, we have to work with whoever we can work with on the continent. And therefore, if you see what we've been doing, I think we've been running an omnidirectional policy for several years, in fact, for the last 2 decades or so. And I think that is the only way to go, because we will have to work with whoever shares our interests on different issues.
Yeah, but let me put you a little away from this maritime thing, but let me focus on the economic aspect, which you've been focusing in your book as well, where you highlighted the significance of globalization that is pushing the economic development and interdependence of economies. So, however, one of the factors globalization has is that it has created asymmetrical relationship between multiple powers in Asia. So, how do you see these asymmetrical powers play a role to push the rise of Asia at the heart of global order?
Well, not everyone gained equally from globalization. Within societies, it accentuated inequality. We've seen it ourselves in India, but it happened in China. China has a much worse Gini coefficient even than we do. But also between societies. I mean, China was a huge beneficiary of the globalization decades, but so were we, probably the second biggest beneficiary. We managed to pull something like 140 million people out of poverty between 2001 and 2011. That's quite an achievement, something we had never done on that scale ever before. So it seems to me that globalization accentuated inequalities in the international system, but it also meant a huge shift in the balance of power. And frankly, in the book, I'm less interested in the economic consequences than in the political consequences. And it had 2 big consequences. One is, as I said, the balance of power shifted to new emerging economies. The US share of global GDP has stayed roughly steady since 1980 onwards. It's roughly around 25%, 26, 27, in that range. But the European share has now declined down to about 30%. When you take just OECD economies, in 1980, they accounted for 60% of the global GDP. Now, no longer. Now, actually, India and China's combined share, PPP GDP figures, is roughly the same as that of the US, in fact, a little more. And the sources of growth in the global economy are actually in Asia. Our China, our India, our Korea, these are the economies. China contributed something like 30% of global growth in 2019, before COVID hit us all. So it seems to me this is the most dynamic area, but that also makes it one of the most unstable areas. Why? Because globalization has led to this becoming one geopolitical space. I mean, today, frankly, missile ranges, technology, ICT has made these borders irrelevant. So because it's become one economic space, it's also become one geopolitical space in technological terms. And today, contention, you can see, is across the whole maritime space, for instance, the whole Indo-Pacific. In the past, people used to segment these waters, the seas near China, etc. But now it's across the whole, because we all have global interests, thanks to the results of what has happened in the last 3 decades. Third consequence, because globalization in many countries has been seen as a threat to identity, and because people have got used to very high growth rates, but now actually the global economy, since 2008, but more recently, it has slowed down. Governments are no longer able to deliver what they were capable of delivering before in terms of high growth, future expectations. So increasingly they rely on nationalism. And across the world, you've seen the election of authoritarian leaders. Some of them nativist almost, going back and appealing to nationalism, to chauvinism, and so on. Now, this, frankly, it's their own business who people elect. But the problem for the international system is that authoritarian leaders who base their legitimacy on nationalism find it much more difficult to do the normal business of diplomacy, give and take, bargaining, compromise. These things become much more difficult if you're playing to a big nationalist gallery at home all the time. So therefore, it makes conflict resolution, crisis management much more difficult. And so already we're in a fraught situation. All the hotspots are live. The balance of power is shifting. People can make mistakes. And people can be tempted to do silly things. But the ability of the system to deal with it, the political system, is much less than it was before. So therefore, I say that globalization has had quite some pretty dramatic political effects. And that's what we're really dealing with. We're dealing with the rise of China, we're dealing with new authoritarians, we're dealing with a shifting balance of power, and we're dealing with it without where the old multilateral order, international order, and so on, is no longer capable of coping. It's not working. You saw what happened in the pandemic. What did the UN do? What did G20 do? What did G7 do? What did WHO do? Ultimately, each country was left on its own. You've seen vaccine nationalism at work. So you therefore don't have the institutional structures or the international order to take care of these problems. And that's why I think this is both a moment of danger, but also a moment of opportunity for those who want to change things.
Yeah, I mean, you just pointed about the poverty in India has really gone down, but I think the pandemic is going to
had gone down. I mean, the pandemic actually has unfortunately pushed many people back down the
and considering that China is trumping about rooting out absolute poverty. I mean, one of the focus that we really need to see how these things evolve when the pandemic comes to an end. But your book actually focuses on India-China relationship from past to present and looking at the recent developments between the two powers and the rise of other multitude of powers when you're talking about Indo-Pacific and all that, US, Australia, and Japan. How do you foresee the revision of India-China relationship with influence on the Asian geopolitics?
So in effect, what we saw was accumulating stress and a big crisis in 2020 spring when China tried to change the status quo. And succeeded in some areas. In other areas, I think we've negotiated back to something approximating the previous status quo. So we're in crisis. We are in the process of trying to reset it. But today, say how it's going to be reset, because this is something that both sides will have to agree on. And both sides seem to have a different take. Today, the Chinese are saying, let's go back to business as usual. We are saying we can't go back to business as usual as long as there's tension on the border, as long as peace and tranquility on the border has been disturbed. And quite frankly, what the Chinese did broke the agreements of 1993, 1996, and tore up all the standard operating procedures and other things we had agreed on how to manage the border, which had worked for about 30 years. They kept the border peaceful. They kept the border where it was. The line had not, the situation on the ground had not changed until the Chinese tried to change it by force last spring. And we haven't got back to the status quo ante yet. So we are still in the middle of that crisis. So it's very hard to say where we'll go. For me, it's quite clear that India-China relations will politically certainly will be much more adversarial in the years to come. Secondly, this border is now live because the old understandings, I think, the Chinese have trashed in effect. So we will have to make the worst assumptions about their behavior and be prepared for that on the border itself. And that's something that ultimately only India can take care of. We have to take care of it ourselves. Thirdly, I think what happened on the India-China border is symptomatic of a larger Chinese policy push across the board. If you look at Chinese policy in the South China Sea, militarizing it, if you look at the pressure on Taiwan, you look at what they did in Hong Kong, you look at their rhetoric on the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, which they dispute with Japan. And you look at their use, their, how do I say this, their weaponization of economic interdependence, whether it's with Australia, with Canada, with a whole host of countries. Even Norwegian salmon exports, I think, were banned. So I think we're dealing with a very different situation. The rest of the world has the same problem. They're also trying to cope with the consequences of the rise of China and with China's new behavior. Let's see whether China comes to the conclusion that this is not serving her interests, but it's very hard. Once a leader and a country have revealed that kind of ambition and staked that kind of ultra-nationalist position, it's very hard to withdraw. Even if you withdraw those statements, if you stop making them, other people will still assume that that's what you believe and that's what you're going to try and do. And China has proclaimed now under Xi Jinping that they are ready to take center stage, that they're going to play their role in the world. This is very different from Deng Xiaoping's China, which was hide your lights, bide your time, which was a hide and bide strategy, which is frankly the strategy that all successful rising powers in history have followed in the past. Whether China has made her move too soon or whether she judges the situation right, we can't tell. And where India-China relations go, a lot of that will depend on the larger context, on what we see in Asia, what we see between China and the US, and what we see in Chinese power itself and how it works. Let's see. I'm not focused here so much on what will happen today, tomorrow, because frankly, today's COVID, another wave comes, we don't know. And so I'm not trying to predict headlines here, but I do think that we will have some difficult years in our relationship with China. Certainly, I think this next decade is not going to be an easy decade, and that China is our biggest strategic challenge. Thereafter, I don't know. Thereafter, it could go either way.
Yeah. Considering that Xi Jinping is going to be there for a long period of time, and yes, I mean, saying that, you know, the behavior has been a little different from what we expected, or what we were doing in, when we did this Chennai Connect and Wuhan Connect and all of that. We were really thinking about different kinds of spirits coming out. But what has actually come out is a real blow to our own foreign policy, initiatives with the Chinese. But it was a great pleasure talking and listening to you, Ambassador Menon. Hope we continue our interactions, and thank you very much for this time. I wish that you had some classes also for our students here in universities, apart from the Ashoka University, but we miss all of that. So to our viewers, please keep watching and keep looking at our programs and keep learning. Thank you very much. Namaste.